guys, welcome to the How to Study Your Bible class. If you are watching this, it's because you missed our group time together this week, which was our first session. And so we're recording this so that you can stay caught up with the rest of us. We were trying to record the actual class, but we had some technical difficulties. So instead, you get to watch me with these cute headphones on in my son's room. Because this is his setup to be a YouTube gamer. That's his life ambition. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to walk you guys through what we talked about today so that you are up to speed. Sorry, I'm going to try and quit touching the desk so that it's not shaking at you. Okay, so let's jump right in. So for just if there's anybody who's not totally sure what this class is about, the goal of this class is that over the next few months, every other week, we're doing 10 sessions. We are going to be looking at the story of the Bible and learning how to study it, just like the title says. Except we're going to be really intentional about the way that we learn how to study it. We are not just going to be looking at random verses or chapters. We're going to be looking at the biblical story in a chronological fashion. So we're going from beginning to end. We're going from Genesis to the Revelation. Now, obviously, we're not going to cover every single thing in the Bible from Genesis to Revelation. Certainly not in 5 to 10 sessions. But so instead, what we're going to do is we're going to look at what are the foundational sort of building block stories of the Bible. And luckily for us, most of those building block stories center around what we call the biblical covenants. And we will talk a little bit in just a minute about what covenant is and why it is important and why we see that in the Bible. But before we get into any of that, we're just going to start by doing a kind of a quick 5-minute Cliff Notes version of the Bible story. Now, this first class that we're doing is functioning a little bit different than our remaining classes. Our first 5, again, like I said, they're looking at the Bible story chronologically. Our last 5 classes are going to be focused more on Bible study techniques and doing some practical application so that you, when you go and do your study times later on by yourself, you know where to start and how to read this and how to put it into context. But this very first class, like I said, we're starting off with an overview of the Bible, and then we're going to move into what the rest of the classes are going to kind of look like, where we're going to read big chunks of the Bible together. Like by big chunks, I mean like a chapter or 2 at a time, and then talk about why that story is important, how it fits into the Bible timeline, and where we can see the need for Jesus coming from those stories. Because the one thing that we really want to get across in this class is that everything in the Bible is intentional. It's there with a purpose, and that main purpose is to point us to Jesus Christ. So let's get started. Let's take a look at this Bible timeline that's up on your screen. Sorry, I couldn't figure out how to get it to go full screen, so you're going to see my Google Slides outline. And actually I'm going to go to this next one because it's got a little bit more detail on it than that one. So here we have our big 10,000 feet up bird's eye view timeline of the Bible. This is very basic, very bare bones, but it's going to give us a good starting place for understanding, where we are in the Bible story when we do start reading some of the stuff out of the Bible. And it will help kind of place us in context of what the other stuff that's happening around that story is. So let's jump right in and let's go to creation. So that's the easy one, right? Creation is when God created the heavens and the earth. Now, when he created the heavens and the earth, he also created humans. He created a man, he created a woman. He created this beautiful garden for them to live in and be in his presence. He gives them one rule to follow in that garden. They don't follow it, and bam, sin enters the world, and so does a whole slew of problems with that. So our humans, Adam and Eve, as we know them, they get booted from the Garden of Eden, and they end up out here in the real world where things are real hard and real bad sometimes. But what we see happening is that, God is developing a plan here. And so even though Adam and Eve get booted from the garden, the story of humans doesn't end there. It's just where it began. So when Adam and Eve first eat that fruit in the garden, sin comes in. We then jump to the patriarchs, who are our next big group of stories in the Bible. And these are guys like Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Joseph and the 12 tribes of Israel, if any of those names sound familiar. If not, it's okay. We're going to talk about these patriarchs in our next session. Today we're going to go back after this timeline, and we're going to focus in on creation and the flood story with Noah and the ark. But next session, we will be focusing in on these patriarchs. Now, these guys are super important because not only does God have direct interaction and communication with all of them, but they are where we get the people group who are going to be really our main people that we follow throughout the rest of the Old Testament. And they are the Israelites. They come from the patriarchs. They are descendants of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Joseph and those 12 tribes. Okay, so that's our patriarchs. They are mostly located in the second half of Genesis. Then we get to the book of Exodus, which is the second book of the Bible. And that's where we see the story of the Israelites really take off. This is where Moses comes into play. And what has happened is God has aligned himself with the Israelites. He has made a covenant with them that he is going to be their God. They are going to be his people. But unfortunately, they have found themselves enslaved in Egypt by the Pharaoh. So the book of Exodus is the story of the Israelites escaping that enslavement with the help of God. They do eventually get out of Egypt, and they end up wandering in the desert for a long time, about 40 years. And we see, a lot of shady shenanigans happening in the desert. And we get some interesting stories about the Israelites in the book of Exodus. So where are the Israelites going when they're wandering the desert? Where are they trying to get to? Well, that's what gets us to the conquest section. So part of the promise that God makes to his people, the Israelites, is that he's going to give them a land that they can live in safely. And this is the place. This land is land that belonged to these guys down here, the patriarchs. It's where Abraham and Isaac and that whole crew, that's where they lived originally. So God is going to take the Israelites back to this land, and that's what they're wandering around in the desert for, is to get back to this land. They eventually do get there, but unfortunately when they get there, they find that there are already people living there. Ironically, it's other descendants of these guys. And not only are there people living in that land, but there are people living around that land as well who want to also conquer that land. So the conquest books, this is where we see Numbers, really mostly Numbers is where these stories come in. The book of Numbers is where we see the Israelites just at war kind of constantly with these people who already live in the land and the people who live on the outskirts of the land. The Israelites are constantly in battle with them, trying to gain control of that land, which they do eventually. They eventually get control of the land. Again, God gives them this commandment and says, hey, you've got the land now. You need to get rid of anybody in this land who is not an Israelite. So I don't want you intermingling with any of these other people groups that you've been fighting. Of course, the Israelites, not great listeners. So they choose to sort of follow this rule. And they do, banish most people. But then some of the other ones they decide to intermarry with. And occasionally they will adopt a religious practice like idolatry from some of these other people groups. And that causes some big problems. So that leads us to the Judges. Because the Israelites have, chosen these other people groups and not followed God's command to them, what happens is those people they've pushed out start pushing back in, and they start oppressing them. The Israelites repent. They call out to God for help. God comes and helps. Then the Israelites go back to the way they were living their life, and they're oppressed again. They call out, and it's just we've got this cycle that's happening again and again. So what God does is he raises up what are called the Judges. These are our stories like Samson, Deborah, Samuel. These are our guys who were sort of like warrior leaders in a way. They helped the Israelites fight off all these oppressive forces. And some of them were pretty decent. But towards the end of the reign of the judges, we get some bad seeds in that mix. And the Israelite people decide, you know what, we don't really want a judge. What we really want is a king, because all the other cool kids around us have kings that rule them. So that's what we want too. Of course, God says, no, you don't really want a king. You want me to be your king. I am your king. But in true human form, the Israelites think that they know better. So God gives them what they ask for. He gives them a king. And that's how we get into our kingdom section. So we get just a whole slew of kings that happen in these books. These are like First and Second Kings. These are those books of the Bible. Some of them are good. Some of them are kind of meh, and some of them are really awful. And they're all kind of like intermixed. We do eventually get to a string of kind of decent ones. A really good one is David. If you've heard that name before, he was said to be a man after God's own heart. And it is David's son Solomon who ends up building the first temple to God. And that's a big deal in biblical history, and we will get there in later sessions talking about why that is. So that temple gets built, but unfortunately things kind of go downhill with Solomon. He ends up taking a bunch of wives, and things don't go so good from there. And the kingdom that he has been ruling ends up splitting in two. One group goes to the north, one group goes to the south. The group that goes to the north keeps the name Israel. The group that goes to the south takes the name Judah. And they live separated for a while, but then that makes them weaker. And so all those outside forces that have been living around, all those people that have just been kind of trying to get back into this land all this time, see their opportunity, and they attack. And eventually both Israel and Judah fall to other nations. We get the Assyrians and the Babylonians who take over these lands. And the people that are in them are either forced into slavery or they're forced to live in exile. If they're like nobility or something like that, they have to go and live in exile in the land of their oppressors. And this is where we get stories like Daniel in the lion's den, the furnace, the whole book of Ezekiel. All of those were written during the exile time. So the exile lasts about 70 years, roughly, before the Israelites are allowed back into their land. And their land is like the area that we now kind of roughly consider Jerusalem. And that's where they're going back to. So they go back to Jerusalem, and they're allowed to rebuild their temple. And so they do. This is called the Second Temple Era. And this is the same exact temple that we see Jesus in later on in the New Testament, when he is, turning over tables and he's got his whip out, and also when he's teaching and preaching, and just he grows up going to this temple. But that is the temple that gets built during this return period. Then we have 400 years of silence. And what that means is not that, God didn't do anything during those 400 years. It just means that we don't have anything that was written during that time period that went on to be considered biblical canon. So no writings in our Bibles, in the Protestant Bible anyway, that cover this time period. So jump forward and we get to the Gospels. So this is around AD 30. So we have from 450 BC to about AD 30. And this is Jesus. This is where Jesus shows up. And the Gospels, of course, are the stories of his ministry and time on this earth. We jump over again like 30, 40 years into the future past Jesus, and we get the book of Acts, the story of the early church. This follows the apostles after Jesus ascends to heaven and what they do to continue to grow the church and establish the church. We get a lot through the apostle Peter, who was considered the founder of the church. And then we move on to missions. This mostly follows Paul. Paul becomes an apostle later on in the story, and missions is where we see Paul really take the gospel message and start spreading it out to other areas beyond Jerusalem. And then we have the future, because yes, surprise, the Bible has stuff in it that hasn't actually even happened yet. And mostly this is the book of the Revelation, which is apocalyptic literature. It refers to the end times. It's when Jesus is supposed to come back. And we will dip our toes into that just a little bit at the end of our sessions. But this is our bare bones basic Bible timeline, and that's a lot of information. We will give you a packet when you come to the first class when we see you that has this timeline in it, and we'll also have this, which you can sort of see part of, but it gives you a little bit more, like it breaks things down a little bit more, gives you the main characters of each area and some of the basic points. So you'll also have that for a reference because that's a lot. Basically, the big thing that you need to understand about the Bible storyline is that we're following a sinful people who are sinful from creation. We followed this group who we call the Israelites through most of the Old Testament. Is their journey to be God's people. It's their continual struggle with that until eventually they are not able to uphold their end of the bargain. And that is when this new era is ushered in and we get Jesus Christ and we see what the need for a Savior and Messiah is all about. So if you can just kind of have that in your head, the point is that everything here leads up to here. And we can't get here without all of this. And we can't fully understand what is happening here unless we know most of what's happening here as well. And that's what this class is about, is to fill in these gaps so we understand. It's all one story, right? It's all one story that's leading us straight to this cross. Okay, so that's our bird's eye view. Let me get some water real quick because this is the second time I've done this talk today and my voice is starting to leave me here a little bit. All right, so you will see right underneath our main timeline area, we have these lines with arrows and the big names. We have Noah, Abraham, Moses, and David. These are our covenants. These are where we are going to focus a lot of attention in our 5 sessions on. Each session is going to touch on at least one covenant. Today, we're going to talk about Noah. And so it's called the Noahic covenant, Abrahamic. There's the Mosaic covenant. Sometimes it's just called the Israelite covenant. They're the same thing. And there's the Davidic covenant. And you can see roughly where each of these begins timeline-wise, and then where they go to. And you'll notice that 3 out of 4 of these bottom ones have arrows pointing towards the future, because that means that until Jesus comes back, these won't be totally fulfilled until that point. The Mosaic one, the covenant with the Israelites, which we already know that they fell at, that's the only one that we see end, and we see that end with the coming of Jesus the first time. So we're going to get onto all of these. Of course, there is also a 5th covenant. It is called the New Covenant or the New Testament, and that's Jesus. And we'll spend a whole session talking about the New Covenant. Okay, so moving forward, like I said, you've got this sheet for reference. Just read over it. Keep it handy if you need it. There is a video on the Bible Project called Covenants. If you just Google Bible Project Covenants, you can watch it. I'm not going to play it right here. It's only about 5 minutes long, and it just kind of gives you a nice little overview of each of the covenants, like kind of what the general idea behind each of them was, and how they end up sort of playing out a little bit. So if you have 5 minutes, go back and watch this video. But for the sake of just not making you have to sit and watch a video for longer than you have to, or listen to me talk, we're going to go straight into the second part of the class. Now, this part's going to be a little tricky because in the actual classroom time that we did, what we did is we read big chunks of the Bible together, and we talked about those stories. And so instead of me just reading the Bible out loud to you, what I'm going to do is kind of give you the high points so that when you are able to join us in our next class, you know what we've already talked about. And I'll throw out any of like the big questions that we talked about too, so you're not like feeling like you're missing any of that conversation. Okay, so let me skip. We're going to come back to this real quick. But so when we read a story in the Bible, we're going to do a few things. First of all, we have our own kind of class covenant that we agreed upon. And that covenant is that in order to study our Bibles, we have to read our Bibles. And I know that's shocking to hear somebody say you have to read your Bible, but you do. Now, I love things like the Bible Project videos and podcasts and devotionals and commentaries. I think all of those things are fantastic, and they can really help you like focus in on specific subjects and themes. But there is no substitute from actually picking up your Bible and reading it. If you want to know what God says, you have to read what he says. And so that's what we're going to be doing in this class. I made everybody in the class have an actual Bible in their hands instead of like, say, their apps. Again, I love the Bible app. I think it's fantastic if you are on the go. But a big part of this class is understanding where each of these stories fits in the Bible. And so you really just can't do that on an app, especially if you're learning it for the first time. It really helps to have that book like right in front of you, which I left mine, so I'm saying all that, and then I'm going to have to use my app. But it really helps to have that book in front of you, so you can just visually see where in the book you are, because that's one of our questions. So when we read a section, we're going to answer these 5 questions before we answer any other questions, and those questions are these right here. What is happening in the story? Where are we in the Bible timeline? What does the story tell us about human nature? What does it tell us about God's nature? And how does that story get us to Jesus? So especially with these first early stories in Genesis, you're going to have a ton of questions. And most of them are going to start out with, why would God do ... And those are very valid questions. And I want all of your questions. I don't want you to think that none of your questions are important. They are all important. But what I'm going to maybe suggest here is that if we can answer these 5 questions first, that's going to help us get down to at least a lot of, get down to like the root of a lot of where those questions come from, right? And so we're going to start here, and then and as for you guys, if there are questions that you have that I don't address as we're going through, you can text me, email me, stop me when you see me at one night, and we can talk about some of those things. Okay, pushing forward. Here we go. This is where we started. Genesis 1. So hopefully you have a Bible in front of you and you didn't do what I did. But we're going to start with Genesis 1:1, which is where it all begins. Hang on, let me pull it up on my app. Okay. And let me switch over to the NLT because that's what you guys have. All right. So we're not actually going to read. I do want you to read chapter 1, and that's a homework assignment that you guys have. We did not read chapter 1 as a group together. We started in reading together on chapter 2 because I gave like a brief summary of chapter 1, and like I said, there is homework for this class. It's not a lot, and hopefully it's stuff that's already going to have piqued your interest to want to know more about. And this is one of them. So reading chapter 1 on your own and then watching a correlated Bible Project video is part of your homework, and that I'll have a slide for that at the end. But this is where we're starting. So we have our 6 days of creation up here. I know there's a 7th. We'll talk about the 7th in just a minute. But these are our 6 days where God actually created. And if you look at Genesis 1:1, this is the very first thing that we learn about our God of the universe, is that in the beginning, God created. And he created everything. He created the heavens, he created the earth, and he created everything that goes in them. So before God creates, though, if you look at verse 2, this is where we get sort of our first clue about like what were things like before God created. So verse 2 tells us that the earth was formless and empty, and darkness covered the deep waters. Now, to our modern 21st century American ears, darkness and deep waters Sounds like it could be kind of peaceful, right? But those two things, darkness, deep waters, were actually very symbolic in ancient Israel of chaos and disorder. And one of the things that I'm going to be pointing out to you guys as we're reading along in these chapters is sort of the historical context of what is going on around some of these verses and the wordings in the verse. Because one of the things that we have to realize as we're reading the Bible is that while the Bible was 100% written for us, like God foresaw that we as 21st century Americans would be reading the Bible to learn about him, it was not originally written to us. It was written to a very specific people group, being the ancient Israelites, who had their own ways of understanding the world, and they are not the same ways that we understand them today. So there are things that immediately would have triggered thoughts in their head that don't necessarily do that for us today because the meanings have changed. So darkness and deep waters is one of them. That meant total chaos to them. So before God creates, before God gets to his business of organizing, it is chaos. And so we get day one, God creates the light. And not only does he create light, but he separates the light from the darkness. And we get our first day and night. Day two, we get God separates the waters from the heavens. So we get our skies and our sea. In day three, God separates the water from the ground. And so we get our dry land. Now, so if you will notice, the reason I picked this cartoon or whatever it is for this illustration is because it nicely lines up days 1, 2, and 3 with days 4, 5, and 6. Because here is what we see God doing. On the first 3 days, God is creating spaces. So he creates where the light and the dark are. He creates where the sea and the sky and where the land is. Days 4, 5, and 6, he is creating things to be in those spaces. And they line up. So day 1, we get our light and our darkness. Day 4, God creates the sun, the moon, and the stars, the things that give us our light and our darkness. Day 2, God creates this, again, the sky and the sea. So day 5, he creates the birds in the air, fish in the sea. Day 3, we get our dry lands. Day 6, we get our animals, and whoop, there we are right there. There's our humans. So here's what we know about God right off the bat. God is a God of order. He took something that was chaos and he created something that was ordered and useful and beautiful and perfect. So just from chapter 1 of Genesis, we know a lot about God's nature. We know that he is not fickle. We know that he is not reckless. We know that he values order and he values usefulness. God doesn't create spaces that don't have a use. He creates things for all of those spaces that use those spaces. And we're going to see this later too when he creates, we get more into the story of the creation of humans, about our use and what he intended us to be doing in the garden. So while this may seem like sort of a no-duh, of course you want a God who values order and usefulness. This actually is very different from other ancient origin stories around the same time. So besides the fact that our God, so proper name of our God is Yahweh. So besides the fact that Yahweh he is one God, he is not, many gods like the Romans or the Greeks had or other pre-ancient civilizations. He is also a God who is not, like I said, he's not reckless. He's not chaotic. And that was not the case with the majority of other origin stories that developed around this time. We see gods who are really out to serve their own purposes, who use humans as like their slaves to accomplish things. But their intent is not relational. And their intent is not to create a world that is useful and beneficial to people. So, lots that we learn right about God just from the first chapter of our Bible. Now, like I said, there are 6 days up here because these are the 6 days that God created. But we also know there was a 7th day, right? And I guarantee you are thinking right now what it is that God did on that 7th day. And if you go down to chapter 2, somewhere at the beginning of chapter 2. So this is why it's helpful to have your Bible in your hand. So in chapter 2, verse 3. Chapter 2, verse 3, it says, "And God blessed the seventh day and declared it holy, because it was a day when he rested from all his work of creation." So the seventh day, God rested. And the question that I asked the class was, what does that mean? What does it mean for God to rest? Does God get tired? Does he need a nap? Is he drained? Does he just need to sit on his couch and binge watch some Netflix shows for a while? And no. So those are all very modern takes on what it means to rest, right? And what I'm going to suggest is that when we learn that God rested on the seventh day, that the implication there is that God stopped creating because he created his perfect order. And instead of creating on that seventh day, he took up controls of the thing that he had created. So God rested, but God did not leave. He did not abandon. He did not go to sleep. He simply took up the controls of what he had already established. So he stopped creating. He paused creating. So if you are a musician, a rest in the music means a pause. It means where all sound stops. So God stopped his work and he allowed it to be, but he is still at the reins. And I think that's an important distinction, because I think sometimes when we think about the Sabbath and rest, we think, oh, I'm just going to lay in bed all day. And that's probably what God did too. And those are very different things. So there was a seventh day, and that was it. God rested. Okay, so here is where we started reading together as a group. We read Genesis chapter 2 and 3. And what I'm going to ask you to do, instead of me just like reading it to you, because again, that defeats the whole purpose, I'm going to ask you to just like pause me, go get your Bibles, your actual Bible in your hand. Hopefully you have someone in your house. If not, use your app. But, you know, we have youth Bibles. You should get one of those if you don't have one at home. And read Genesis 2 and 3, and then unpause me and come back. All right, see you in a minute. All right, hopefully you did what I said and you're not just staring at me this whole time, but you might be, whatever, that's fine. But anyway, hopefully you read Genesis 2 and 3, because there is a lot of information that we get about how humans began in Genesis 2 and 3. This is the creation story of humans. It's also the story of the fall. It is how sin enters into the world and how we have basically found ourselves in the predicament that we are in today in this broken world. So let's start with our 5 questions. And because you are just listening to me talk, you get to just listen to me answer too. But we did toss these around in the class, and we did get a lot of interesting answers too. So I'm going to kind of briefly walk you through some of the stuff that we talked about just to get you up to speed. All right, so what is happening in this story? So Genesis 2 and 3, we get the creation of humans. It starts with the creation of Adam, the man, and then Eve is created as his helper. Now, sometimes we, again, with our modern ears on, we hear that word helper and we think, oh, like Eve was created to be like Adam's assistant. And that's not the case. That word helper that is used for Eve, I'm not going to try and pronounce it in Hebrew because I'm going to butcher it, but it is a very specific noun that goes much more in depth than just the word helper does. And it's actually an adjective that we see sometimes applied to God himself. It is a partner. It is an equal. So we see originally Eve's intent was to be Adam's partner. And if you look down in Genesis 2, (15), it says the Lord God placed the man in the Garden of Eden to tend and watch over it. So tending and watching over the garden was man's first assignment. And Eve was given to Adam to help him do that. We were meant to be caretakers of the land. And the land, as it was created, wanted a caretaker. It wanted to produce and grow and be useful, because that's the way God created it before sin entered into the world. So here we've got our man and our woman. They've been created. They've been put to work tending this garden. So like Adam and Eve aren't just like lounging around and, eating grapes all day long. They have jobs, and their job is to take care of this space that God has created for them. So God ends up giving them one rule. And as we read, that rule is that they should not eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. So there's two trees that Adam and Eve are not supposed to go near. One is the tree of garden of good and evil. One is the tree of life. They're supposed to kind of stay away from those. And God specifically says, don't eat from this tree. Basically, because you're not prepared for what's going to happen if you do. So, of course, Adam and Eve don't listen. And there is a serpent who is a chaos animal. And we just learned from chapter 1 that God doesn't like chaos, but chaos found its way into the garden. And the serpent convinces first Eve, who then convinces Adam to eat of the fruit. And that is where we see things go haywire very quickly, and ultimately leads to Adam and Eve having to leave the garden because they have disobeyed. They have let sin in, and it is no longer the space that God created it to be. And so we see this interaction between Eve and the snake, and then between Eve and Adam. And then we see God giving Adam and Eve sort of his final parting words to them. And those are like in chapter 3. Three, 14, all the way down to the end of chapter 3. That's where we see God sort of giving his final thoughts on this whole thing. We see he curses the serpent. He curses the snake. He does not curse Adam and Eve, though. What happens if you read down, it doesn't say he curses them. What he is talking to them about is the consequences of their actions. So we get this little series where God first addresses the serpent, then he addresses Eve and says, now that sin is here, death is here, you're going to experience pain in childbirth, and your desire is going to be for your husband, and he's going to rule over you. And I know if you're a girl watching this, you're like, oh, that sucks. But what I hear, and yes, it does. But let me just clarify that I don't think this necessarily means that. So what I know it doesn't mean is that God is like punishing women by making childbirth painful. In fact, I have a feeling it probably always would have been painful to some degree. But I think what is happening here, and from not just what I think, but from the studying that I've done, is that if we're looking at this not as a curse, but as a consequence of sin, what has happened is that there is now a new element to the idea of being pregnant and giving birth that involves death that was not there before in the garden. And it's hard to explain if you're not a parent, but I think the easiest thing to say is that whether you're a mom or a dad, the moment that you find out that new life is coming into the world, you're very excited. But it's also the moment that you start worrying about when that life might leave this earth. And before sin, before death, that was not a thing that a woman would have had to worry about. But now that death is here, we do have to worry about it. And we're also ancient Israelites, right? So we don't have epidurals. We don't have hospitals. Childbirth is a dangerous, dangerous thing where not only can you have a lot of risk of losing your child, but you also have a risk of losing your own life. A lot of women died in childbirth. So these are all new factors that have been brought into the idea of just, being fruitful and multiplying. In the garden were not there. Now, Adam doesn't get off totally either. Though, again, I think, again, if you're a girl watching this, you're like, seems like he gets off easier than us. But we're told that he's going to have to toil now. If you remember, his original job was to take care of the garden. It was to tend the garden, and the garden wanted that. It wanted to be tended. But now we're not in the garden anymore. And this land is not as receptive to the idea of being tended. In fact, it's going to give Adam a really hard time. Whereas, especially getting food from it is going to be a lot of work, whereas in the garden, it wasn't. Again, the big thing to take away from this, again, is that these are not like additional curses that God decides to just like tag on to his warning about not eating from the tree. These are the consequences of sin. When sin came in, death came in. When death came in, all of these additional bummer of a deal came in with it. And these are the things that God is telling Adam and Eve. This is the reality that you're facing now. And so he asked Adam and Eve to leave the garden. Before he does, he sews them up some cute little clothes with fig leaves, but then he sends them on his way. So that was a really long explanation of what was happening in that story. Sorry, got kind of carried away with the story part there. But question number 2 is, where are we in the Bible timeline? That's an easy one. We're at the very, very, very beginning. What does this story tell us about human nature? So basically, is that we want to be in control. Even when we have things perfectly in place for us, we still think that we know better than God, and we want to have that decision. If you want to say, like, what is the tree of the knowledge of good and evil all about? It's about wisdom. It's about being able to discern between good and bad. And up until this point, God was the one who made that decision. After Adam and Eve eat the fruit, they make the decisions too. This is a lot about a power struggle with them also trying to be on the same footing as God when they are not, and they never will be. But the idea there is that this tree of the fruit of knowledge of good and evil, is there not as I think somebody in the class called it like a pop quiz, like God's first pop quiz. And I don't think that's what it's about. I think it's more about Adam and Eve not being prepared for that wisdom that they took. I think the tree was there because eventually they would have been. And the idea was for them to be in God's presence until they got to a place where they were able to sort of take on more of that responsibility. But they never got there. They chose to take it for themselves, and they chose to try and make themselves equal with God. And we're going to see that theme pop up a lot of times in the Old Testament as well, where people just want to take the reins away from God, and it doesn't work out super well. So that's what we learn about human nature, is our inclination is towards, we want to be in control. What does it tell us about God's nature? Well, we already learned from Genesis 1 that he's into order. He's into organization. He's into some rules. And I think a lot of times we learn, or we want to learn, or we want to hear that God is just all, love and fluff and kisses. And he is a lot of that. But he also has expectations of us, and he has given us rules to follow, and we are expected to follow them. And when we don't follow them, bad things happen. And I think that's what we get about the nature of God, is he's trying to tell us how to live our best lives. And if we ignore that rule, then we're going to go into a space that was not intended for us. And that's sort of a general life theme as well, right? So question 5 is, how does the story get us to Jesus? Do we see Jesus anywhere in this story? And yes. So obviously, if there is no fall, if there is no sin entering the story, we don't need Jesus thousands of years down the road to reconcile all that. But there's a lot of people who think in Genesis 3:15, if you go and read that, or if you remember from the breakout session that I taught a few months ago, there is the verse about the serpent and the seed of woman crushing the serpent's head. And a lot of people believe that that is foreshadowing Jesus, that he is the seed of woman who is going to crush the serpent or sin's head ultimately. And so we do see Jesus popping up right here, the very beginning of Genesis, which I think is super cool. So I think that covers most of the stuff that we talked about for this verse, for Genesis 2 and 3 in class. I'm trying to remember if anybody else had any thoughts. I mean, of course, people ask about why God would even bother putting this tree in the garden. Didn't he know that we would do this? And my answer here is simply that I don't know why God does what he does, at least not all the time. And that's okay, because I don't think we're supposed to. And I think a lot of times, especially with these early Genesis stories, we get sort of bogged down with the details, right? Like, you know, could that really have happened that way? Like, that doesn't make any sense. And we'll see this again with the Noah story about sort of like, what? But what I'm going to encourage you to do is, instead of, focusing in on the trees, if you heard that expression, you're losing the forest for the trees. Instead of focusing in on the trees, on those like kind of question mark details that we're never going to have like a satisfactory answer for, at least not on this earth. Focus on the forest. Focus on, especially the answers that we're getting from the questions up on your screen right now. Focus on what are we learning about who God is. And I think if we focus in on that, then either a lot of those sort of those like minor detail questions aren't going to be as concerning, or we'll be able to point to the nature of God that we do know and say, okay, this makes sense, knowing what I know about God and how he responds to certain things. Okay, so that is Genesis 2 and 3. Genesis 4. We did not read Genesis 4. I just kind of briefly skimmed over this. This is the story of Cain and Abel. And in your little packets that you'll get, you will see that there is a little genealogy chart that we've got going on, and we'll be working on this one for the next 2 sessions, and then we'll get another one as we go, because I couldn't fit everything onto one page. But so we'll see. So Adam and Eve are outside the garden now, right? So, and one of the things that I want you to keep in mind as we are talking about sort of order and disorder and chaos and those kind of things is that the Bible depicts a lot of this in like a spatial relation to God. So if you think of like God as being like at the center of the Garden of Eden. So let's say that God lives at the heart of Eden. Okay, this is God's space. Adam and Eve are out here in the Garden of Eden, which is the space surrounding Eden, surrounding God's temple, his space. And this space is, it's organized, it's God created. And it's a space where God and humans can be together. But then once we get outside that garden, we're getting further and further away from order, from God, and we're getting into disorder and chaos. And we see the story mimicking that. And so and also side note real quick, I refer to this as a story a lot, but that does not mean I think any of this is fictional. It just means that it's told in narrative form. So it's just easiest to refer to as a story. But we do see like narrative elements happening, and this is one of them. So we see Adam and Eve get, they have to leave the garden to the east, and the east becomes like this symbol for a land of chaos, right? It's just where if you keep moving east, things are not going well for you. So we've got Adam and Eve who have moved out of the garden to the east. They have children. The first 2 children they have are Cain and Abel. You guys, I'm sure, have heard of them. I won't say they get into a fight, because that's not really what happens, but Cain gets jealous of Abel and he ends up murdering him. So we have our first murder in the Bible. So that is how quickly we went from death is in the world to murder is in the world. First generation past our garden humans, and we are murdering each other. So Cain murders Abel and has to kind of wander the earth from then on. He doesn't have like a homeland, and Cain gets pushed further east. The Bible tells us that Cain goes east even from where Adam and Eve are, which means Cain is going even further into disorder and chaos. But now Abel is dead, and sort of to keep that world populating, Adam and Eve have another son down the line, and his name is Seth. We don't get a whole lot of information about Seth, but we do know that Seth is important because it is through Seth that the line to Jesus continues. So all of our yellow boxes are the big names that we're following to see how we're all connecting to get to Jesus. And we'll fill in these blanks as we go. But Seth is our first stop on that journey. Like I said, there's not any stories about Seth, so I really don't know what he was like, but he must have been okay. So between Seth and Noah, there are 7 generations. So Noah is a direct descendant of Seth. Now, ancient Israelite genealogies are a little wonky. They're not exact, but roughly 7 generations are in between these guys. So anywhere from 700 years to, I don't know, some of these guys for a really long time. So it could have been a couple of thousand years, I guess. But eventually we get to Noah. Now, in between Seth and Noah, we also get Genesis 6, which is nicely titled A World Gone Wrong. If you have some time, go back and read that too. It's a weird little story that we get about the sons of God, basically having, mating with the daughters of the earth and kind of some of the disorder that causes. We don't really know who the sons of God are exactly. There's a lot of theories. Some people think that they are actually referring to like angels or other like spiritual beings or heavenly beings, which we do know exist. But so some people think that's who that is. Other people think that sons of God refers to the descendants of Seth. And some people think that sons of God refers to like royalty or kings at that time who often called themselves sons of God. I don't know. I don't know who they are. I do think that what we can pick up from chapter 6 is that things have gone wrong and they just continue to go wrong. In fact, we are just sort of spiraling out of control to now we're at this place where we've got people named the sons of God, procreating with human women. And it seems like that's not really what God intended. And we get these people called the Nephilites, the giant Nephilites, or the Nephilim, who come in down in verse 4. And interestingly, we will see them again. We will see these people referred to, these giants, referred to again when we get to like the end of Exodus, early Numbers, where the Israelites have entered that land and they find these giants living in that land. So we'll see them again. But the big thing to take away from Genesis 5 is if you scroll down, you will see how God decides that he is going to deal with all of this chaos that has erupted into the world. And we see in verse 5, it says, the Lord observed the extent of human wickedness on the earth, and he saw that everything they thought or imagined was consistently and totally evil. It's not good. And he was sorry that he ever made them and put them on the earth. It broke his heart. And the Lord said, I'm going to wipe the human race I've created from the face of the earth. Yes, and I will destroy every living thing, all the people, the large animals, the small animals, the scurrying along the ground, even the birds of the sky. I'm sorry I ever made them. But Noah found favor with the Lord. So here's where God makes the decision that things have gone too wrong to just easily fix. Something major is going to have to happen here. Luckily, God finds one guy who he still likes, and that is Noah. And we should all be very grateful for Noah because without him, we would not be sitting here watching this video right now. Okay, so then we jump to the story of Noah, and we read Genesis 7. So again, pause me, read Genesis 7. This is where we get the setup for what's happening. And then come back to me and we'll talk about chapter 8. So pause me, read 7. Okay, so back to me. Hopefully you pause me. So what happens in the story? Noah, his wife, his sons, and their wives. Noah builds an ark because God tells him to. His family, they get on this ark. They take with them 2 of every animal, a male and a female, and the waters come, the floods come, and they wipe out all life on the earth. Somebody asked me what happened to the sea creatures. I don't know. I assume they were okay since they were already in the water, but who knows? Maybe the water was so turbulent that they didn't survive either. I'm not real sure. Again, that's another tree in the forest. But so Noah and his wife and his sons and their wives are on the ark. It says it rained for 40 days and 40 nights. We will see that terminology, 40 days, 40 nights, 40 years. Really, any time a 40 is involved in a timeline kind of perspective, we should not take that necessarily literally. That was an idiom, which means like an expression. So we have idioms in the English language, like it's raining cats and dogs. Like, where does that come from? Who knows what that means? If you're not American, somebody says that to you, you're like, what? But if you're American, you understand that means it's raining hard. So if you're an ancient Israelite, you understand that 40 days and nights means it rained for a really long time. And Noah and his family are on that boat for a really long time. But eventually we get to chapter 8 where it talks about the waters receding. Sorry, I hit the camera. And what Noah does is he sends out a bird every now and then to see if the waters have receded enough for it to be safe for them to get off the boat. So the idea is if the bird flies away and doesn't come back, then he's found somewhere to land. And eventually that happens, and actually a dove comes back and brings a piece of an olive branch with him. So Noah knows that the waters have receded enough that this bird found a tree to land on. And that is where we picked up reading with Genesis 9. And this is where we get our first covenant. So actually it starts, I think, at the end of 8. So again, pause me and read Genesis 8:20 through 9. It's 17. Yeah, 9:17. So stop when you get to Noah's sons and then come back to me. All right, welcome back. And okay, so what have we learned happened here? So the waters receded. Noah and his family get off the boat and they make a sacrifice to God right away. And God's pleased with the sacrifice. And so what God does is he makes a covenant with Noah. And what is that covenant? That covenant is that he is not going to destroy the world again. It says flood. He's not going to use flood waters, but generally we can extrapolate that to the idea that God's not going to destroy all of life in any sort of one swoop fashion. Now that doesn't mean that like natural disasters and things won't happen, but there will not be like a grand scale global event that will destroy all of human life. But God has made that promise, that covenant with us, and the sign of that covenant is the rainbow. It's in the sky. So that's a pretty cool thing that we've still got today that we can look at and point to. But this is where that covenant comes in. And this is our first major one. This is the first time we see that God is establishing this covenantal relationship in specific wording with humans. Now, there's a lot of people who think that there was also a covenant with Adam. We don't get to see that like worded out in Genesis. I agree, there probably was one. But as far as it like specifically being called out, Noah is our first one that we get that language of covenant in. And this is important because a covenant, and we kind of, if you watch that Bible Project video, that's helpful. But a way to think about a covenant is it's like a contract on relational steroids. To our 21st century ears, contracts are very legalistic and they can be very impersonal. So that's why I don't like to use that word specifically. Covenant takes it up a notch. Covenants are built on relations. They are built on people who choose to be in agreement with each other, and they are making a binding agreement or promise that usually centers around loyalty and faithfulness. And we see people throughout the Old Testament, even when God's not directly involved, we see some of our characters in the Old Testament create covenants with their neighbors, with their friends. This was like a general way of doing business in the Old Testament days. Nobody was writing up legal contracts back then. Instead, what they had were these covenants. These are these binding relational agreements of loyalty that they had with each other. And this is the first time we see God doing that with a human. And this is pivotal, because what has happened here is that we basically had a new creation story happen, right? So God brought the waters, he wiped everybody out, and now we are starting over again with Noah and his family. So Noah is like our new Adam. And we even see a lot of that language mirrored. So like if you'll look at, let's see. If you look at Genesis 9, and I said you should have read through 9:17. So at the beginning of 9, God says to Noah, be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth. Those are the exact same words he said to Adam and Eve in chapter 1 of Genesis. We get that same be fruitful and multiply. Now, what is different is in Genesis 1, God's commandment is to be fruitful and to multiply, and basically to tend to the animals and the livestock, to take care of them. And now we've got a little bit of a twist to that. That's not the same thing that he says to Noah. What he says to them is that be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth, all the animals of the earth, all the birds of the sky, all the small animals that scurry along the ground, and all the fish in the sea will look on you with fear and terror. I have placed them in your power. I have given them to you as food. So we have a relationship that has changed between man and animal that wasn't the same in Eden. So now animals are food, whereas before we were their caretakers. Now we have power over them. So we are now in a new world. And instead of just abandoning us to this new world with its new rules, God has enters into a covenantal relationship with us to give us hope that this is going to end somewhere good. So some of the questions that came up during this section, there was some ask about the murdering part. Like if you murder someone, then if you kill a man, then you'll be killed by a man, and how that whole system works. And this is sort of where we see God setting up some parameters for the first legal system. I think specifically the question was, isn't that just perpetuating a cycle of murder? And again, I'm not 100% sure, but I think the idea here is sort of if you murder someone, say out of hate, then you'll be held accountable for their life, and that somebody else may take your life, not necessarily out of hate, not because they necessarily hate you, but because there are rules and laws. This is where we get into sort of our eye for an eye part of that Old Testament that we talk about a lot. It's not a fantastic system. It's not a system that we wanted to stay in, and we should all be grateful that Jesus came and changed those rules for us. But this is where it begins. We are now in a place where God has accepted that humans are sinful from the get-go. And instead of just saying, all right, well, I'm done with all of you, he's going to give us another chance, and he's going to establish this relationship with us and give us a promise that he's in it for the long run. He's going to give us the solution to this problem. It's going to take thousands of years to get to that solution, and his name is going to be Jesus, but we will get there eventually. And so there's something hopeful to kind of look forward to there. And that's where we get to the answer to our last question right here, is how does the story get us to Jesus? So the Noahic covenant is still in effect. Took place, went into effect, who knows how long ago? Could be thousands, could be millions. Yeah, I have no idea. And we are still living under the Noahic covenant. We still have that promise that God is not going to destroy the earth. But we do know that Jesus will come back, and he will unite this earth with heaven. And so that's going to change the game. And so when Jesus comes back, the Noahic covenant will end because Jesus is here. Okay, so that was what happened in the story. Where are we in the biblical timeline? Again, we're right after creation. We're right after the fall. And now we're seeing sort of an echo of what happened just a few chapters before, where sin has just gotten us into kind of a poop of a situation, and some correction has to be made. What do we know about God, about human nature from this story? We know a few things. I mean, straight up, God says right up here when he's making the covenant that he now realizes that we are sinful from birth. So this isn't a fixable problem. This isn't maybe eventually down the road they'll be born without this desire to be sinful. Like, this is who we are. And so God's going to work with us. We also see that we are redeemable. We get Noah, who, stands in for like basically all of good human people who are trying to be faithful to God. We see that there is still a remnant there of redeemableness that's happening, and we see that God is faithful to that. That's what it tells us about God's nature. So again, from these stories, we do not get the God is love and fluff, or at least not all love and fluff, but we get a God who is authoritative, who is in control, who has an order that he has established. Now, he is also a God of compassion. He is a God who is willing to rewrite the rules when he sees that they need to be rewritten. And he's willing to work with us within the confines of the situations that we have gotten ourselves into. And that's a thing that I think we have to acknowledge with these stories. Is it's very tempting, very, very tempting to be like, well, God set us up for failure. He should have known we were going to do that. And that is not what we're seeing happening here. We're seeing that God set us up for success and we chose failure. And when we choose failure, there are natural consequences that happen. And that is something that we're going to see play out time and time again throughout the Bible, that our choices have consequences. But that we are lucky to have a faithful God who continues to find something redeemable in us throughout the whole process, and eventually provides us with that Savior who will be the ultimate redemption, because that is what the story is. It is, or the Bible is, it is a story of redemption, and we are just at the beginning of it. So let's take a look real quick at our genealogies. So this is where we were. Then we got to their 7 generations between Seth and Noah. Now, Noah has 3 sons. We're almost done, so just hang with me. I know this is an hour and a half, and I have gone my full hour and a half for the second time today, so I'm about to wrap this up for you. But so here are Noah's sons, and we see them come in at the end of chapter 9. You can go and skim over that too, because so we got Shem, Ham, and Japheth. I know those are fantastic names, and please, I'll name your firstborn son Shem or Ham or Japheth. But these are, well, the line of Shem. Again, great name. He sounds like one of the Three Stooges. This is where we're going to see the line of Jesus continue. So when we trace all this stuff back, this is where we're coming from. Okay, so we've got Shem, and we're going to see he is directly connected to Abraham down the road. But these are Noah's sons. And at the end of chapter 9, we get this sort of weird story about Noah getting drunk off some wine in his vineyard, and his middle son, Ham, does something weird. It's not real clear what it is. He sees Noah naked, and then, I don't know, some bad stuff happens from there, and ends up with Noah cursing Ham, specifically Ham's son, Canaan. And we're going to see that be an issue down the road in the Old Testament as well. But these are Noah's sons. And so for the next session, we'll be filling in these down here. In the next session, we're going to hop right into Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Joseph and our 12 tribes of Israel, which is who our Israelites come out of. You do have a little bit of homework. Your homework is, again, to go back and read Genesis chapter 1, which you may have already done, but read it all. And then watch the Bible Project video, Genesis 1 visual commentary. Just Google these words with Bible Project, and you should be able to find it pretty easily. And then you're going to read the next story that comes after the story of Noah and his sons and that whole mess. is the Tower of Babel. It's Genesis 11, and we'll touch on this briefly when we get back together in a couple of weeks. You're going to see whether or not humans have learned their lesson, and spoiler alert, they have not. So we're going to see what they get up to next in our next session. Okay, I think that is everything. If not, I'm sure you're tired of me anyway. I'm really glad you guys are watching this, choosing to watch this, choosing to spend your time doing this. We'll be praying for you all and hoping that God blesses your week. And we will see you in a couple of weeks to start up with the Patriarchs. All right, bye, you guys.